"You don't belong here anymore." Those were the first words Karen ever spoke to me, delivered with the icy precision of a judge passing down a sentence. I can still see her face, chin raised, nostrils flared, eyes darting around my porch as if cataloging every possible violation. Her clipboard was gripped so tightly that the metal clip reflected the morning light like a blade. I laughed at first, because what else could I do? Who opens their own front door only to be greeted by a stranger declaring exile from their own property? But that laugh didn't last. Her voice cut through the mountain air like a siren. "This cabin is within the jurisdiction of the Valley Lake Homeowners Association, and you, sir, are trespassing." Trespassing on land my family had owned since 1972. You can imagine my disbelief. The morning had started quietly, mist curling up from the lake, the smell of pine resin and wood smoke hanging in the air, the kind of morning that makes you feel grateful to be alive. But in an instant, that peace curdled into confrontation. A clipboard, a stranger, and a single sentence detonated years of tranquility. What would you do if someone tried to erase your right to exist in your own home? Would you laugh it off? Close the door? Or like me, would you feel something darker? An urge to dig, to document, to uncover what game was being played against you? Because that's exactly what I did. 3 weeks earlier, I hadn't even heard the name Valley Lake HOA. The cabin had always been outside the cluster of vacation homes built along the southern ridge. Those houses were new money projects, glass-fronted monstrosities with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. My cabin was older, tucked deep into the pines, shielded from view by its very distance. My father bought it before there was even a paved road cutting through the ridge. He built the deck by hand, one plank at a time. The idea that some association, formed decades later, could claim dominion over it was laughable. And yet here she stood, telling me otherwise. According to Section 5.2 of our bylaws, all properties within the Valley Lake perimeter are required to maintain compliance with HOA standards. I cut her off. Perimeter? Lady, this cabin predates your standards by 50 years. She smirked. That may be true, but boundaries evolve. Our survey last year shows this parcel inside our jurisdiction. I felt my stomach tighten, because here's the thing. Survey lines can change, sometimes quietly, sometimes deliberately. Municipal annexations, redrawn plats, updated zoning maps. If you're not paying attention, your property can suddenly fall under someone else's thumb. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know just how sharp that thumb can press. Karen didn't wait for my response. She scribbled something on her clipboard and said, "You'll receive a formal notice in the mail. Failure to comply can result in daily fines up to $200. Then she turned, heels crunching against the gravel, and marched back toward a gleaming white Lexus parked at the edge of my driveway. The vehicle was spotless, almost sterile, its vanity plate reading HOA 1. I watched her drive off, dust swirling in her wake, heart pounding in my chest. That was the cold open, the first skirmish, but the war was only beginning. Later that day, the notice arrived exactly as she promised, slid under my door in a glossy envelope with the Valley Lake HOA crest embossed in gold. I opened it at my kitchen table, the paper thick, almost ceremonial. Inside was a welcome packet that read less like hospitality and more like a list of demands. Repaint exterior to earth tone neutral. Replace rustic wooden fence with approved composite barrier. remove firewood stack from visible areas, and, my favorite, apply for residency approval. Residency approval for my own cabin. That night I pulled the packet apart line by line, my father's old property deed spread out beside it. The deed was ironclad, recorded with the county clerk decades before Valley Lake even existed. But HOA bylaws are written like traps, full of vague language and conditional clauses, and I could see exactly what Karen was doing. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was expanding territory. 2 days later, I drove down to the county records office. The clerk, a fen man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, scrolled through parcel maps on his computer. "Strange," he muttered. "Looks like there was a boundary adjustment filed last year. Valley Lake petitioned for annexation of several lots on the north side of the ridge. Was this cabin included?" He squinted at the screen. "Yes, but the filing is odd. No counter-signature from the affected property owners." That was my first real piece of evidence. When I returned, Karen was waiting again, this time parked at the foot of my driveway. She waved me down like a traffic cop. "You're already past your first compliance deadline. The board is prepared to issue fines unless you demonstrate good faith." "Good faith?" I said, gripping the steering wheel. "How about you show me the vote where this cabin joined your association?" Her smile didn't waver. "We operate by majority consent. Valley Lake homeowners approved the annexation unanimously." "But I'm not a Valley Lake homeowner." Her eyes gleamed. "Not yet." There it was, her tell. This wasn't about bylaws or surveys. It was about control, expansion, empire building, one lot at a time. Neighbors whispered about her in the general store. Some called her the sheriff, others the warden. Stories spilled out in hushed tones, fines for hanging wind chimes, citations for leaving trash cans out an hour past pickup, demands to remove satellite dishes that disrupted the visual harmony. One man told me Karen forced him to repaint his front door because she claimed the shade of blue clashed with the lake. I started keeping a journal. Every interaction logged, every notice photographed, every conversation dated and time-stamped, because in HOA disputes, paper is power. Courts don't care about outrage, they care about records. And the more I recorded, the clearer the pattern became. Karen was manufacturing violations faster than anyone could respond. Each letter carried a threat of escalating fines. Each meeting agenda listed community harmony as justification. The board was a rubber stamp. Neighbors too tired or too afraid to resist. But I wasn't afraid. 1 week later, I attended my first HOA meeting. Held in the Valley Lake Clubhouse, the setting was part country club, part courtroom. Long tables arranged in rows, residents seated with manila folders, Karen at the front beneath a banner reading, "Building a Better Community." Her clipboard was replaced with a gavel. Yes, an actual gavel. I stood at the back, unnoticed at first. She launched into her opening remarks about preserving property values and ensuring compliance. Her voice was honeyed but sharp, every phrase designed to sound benevolent while tightening the noose. Then I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, stepping forward. Every head turned. Karen froze mid-sentence. "My name is Daniel. I own the cabin at the North Ridge, and unless I've missed something, I never joined this HOA." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's face flushed, but she kept her composure. "This is not the appropriate forum for individual grievances," she said firmly. "Oh, I think it is, because what you've done, annexing properties without owner consent, isn't just inappropriate, it's illegal." Silence. Heavy. suffocating silence. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. Her eyes darted toward the board members, then back at me. "We'll address your concerns privately," she said, slamming the gavel. "Meeting adjourned." People shuffled out quickly, avoiding eye contact, but I knew I'd hit a nerve. That night, a second notice appeared on my door. This one wasn't a packet or a welcome. It was a citation. "Failure to comply with HOA residency approval process. Fine balance $600. $600 for existing in my own home. I stood there on the porch, citation trembling in my hand, the night air thick with pine and smoke from distant chimneys. Somewhere out on the ridge and
Pay the lake access fee or the fines will double by Friday. That was Karen's opening salvo, shouted on my porch with the confidence of a general announcing victory. She shook the notice in my face, paper crinkling like a flag in the wind, the ink so fresh it still smelled of toner. I stared at her, stunned. "Lake access fee?" I repeated, as though saying the words might make them vanish. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. $200, monthly. Everyone pays, no exceptions. Everyone. Except, of course, I wasn't everyone. I was the one person she couldn't control. You ever watch someone try to rewrite history right in front of your eyes? That's what this was. I didn't just have access to the lake. My family owned it. Every inch of water, every cattail and lily pad, every trout darting beneath the surface. And yet here she was, claiming authority, waving a bill as if she were the tax collector of some medieval fiefdom. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I folded my arms and asked the only question that mattered. "And if I don't pay?" Her lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Then you'll find out what happens to people who don't respect the Valley Lake HOA. That line, that smug little prophecy. It was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a misinformed neighbor or a bureaucratic mistake. I was staring down a woman who believed she owned the valley itself. But let's rewind. 3 weeks earlier, I returned to the cabin for the first time in years. The drive up the mountain looked different. Back when my father was alive, the ridge was wild. Yards spilled into forests, boats sat rusting at the shoreline, and no one cared if your shutters were peeling or your grass grew waist-high. It was freedom, unpolished but real. Now it looked like Stepford had swallowed the valley whole. Mailboxes painted the same shade of beige, lawns clipped to regulation height, driveways pressure-washed until they gleamed. Not a single basketball hoop or tire swing in sight. Neighbors who once greeted me with waves now offered tight smiles, their eyes darting nervously toward Karen's Lexus, parked like a watchtower at the clubhouse entrance. I stopped at the general store to grab coffee and caught whispers between two locals. "Got fined for a hammock last week," one muttered. "Mine was the wind chimes. Apparently they disturbed the uniform soundscape, whatever that means." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about paint colors or trash cans. Karen had built a machine, a bureaucracy disguised as a community. And everyone was paying for it, literally. Dues had ballooned to nearly $500 a month. Failure to pay meant liens, and liens meant foreclosure. She wasn't protecting property values, she was leveraging them. So when Karen handed me that lake access fee, it was more than a piece of paper. It was a declaration of conquest. "You've got to be kidding me. This lake is deeded to my family. It's not community property. It's not even part of your development." Her eyes narrowed. Boundaries evolve. The lake is now considered a shared amenity under HOA bylaws, Section 8.4, if you'd like to read it. I wanted to tear the notice in half right there, but I didn't. Because here's the thing about HOA disputes.
outrage gets you nowhere. Paperwork wins wars. That night, I dug into the Valley Lake covenants and restrictions, hundreds of pages, all written in dense, legalistic jargon. And sure enough, buried in Section 8.4 was a clause about community amenities. It lumped together the pool, the clubhouse, and yes, the lake. But here's the catch. The HOA didn't actually own any of those amenities. They leased the pool from the county, they leased the clubhouse from a private trust, and the lake? Well, that was mine. Karen wasn't just bluffing. She was outright lying. I needed proof, something undeniable. So I called the county recorder's office and requested every deed related to the lake. The clerk's voice on the other end confirmed what I already knew. Title to Valley Lake remained in the name of my father, passed down to me through probate. No transfers, no easements, no shared rights. It was ironclad. Armed with the deed, I decided to confront her directly. The next HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the clubhouse. Picture fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs lined in stiff rows, and a podium at the front where Karen presided like a queen in exile. Residents filled the seats, clutching folders and bills, eyes weary but submissive. I walked in holding my father's deed like a weapon. Karen saw me instantly. Her smile faltered for half a second, but she recovered quickly. Ah, Emerus Daniels has decided to join us. Perhaps he's finally ready to become a cooperative member of our community. Actually, I said, my voice steady but loud enough to carry, I'm here to clear up a lie. Every head turned. I laid the deed on the podium so hard the sound echoed. This lake belongs to me. My family bought it before your HOA even existed, and unless I missed something, private ownership trumps your fabricated amenity fees. Gasps spilled through the room. Karen slammed her gavel. "Order!" she barked. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between us like spectators at a tennis match. Some neighbors looked hopeful, others terrified. And in that charged silence, I realized the truth. They wanted me to win. They were too scared to challenge her, but they craved someone who would. Karen ended the meeting abruptly, claiming we would revisit the matter privately. But the damage was done. Her authority had cracked, if only for a moment. When I got back to my cabin, another notice was taped to the door. This one was even bolder than the last. Unauthorized use of community resources. Fine balance, $1,200. Unauthorized use of my own lake. I stood there in the dark, crickets chirping, the paper trembling in my hand. Rage burned in my chest, but beneath it was something colder. Resolve. Because here's what Karen didn't know. I wasn't just a cabin owner clinging to family land. I was a licensed attorney. Property law was my specialty, and if she wanted a war of paperwork, she had chosen the wrong opponent. But the question that kept me awake that night was this: how far was Karen willing to go to defend her illusion of control? Would she stop at fines and notices, or was she prepared to destroy anyone who dared to expose her lies?
"Turn those saws off before I call the sheriff." That was me, barefoot on the porch at 6 in the morning, voice cracking against the roar of chainsaws. My trees, oak giants planted by my grandfather decades ago, were already bleeding branches onto the gravel driveway. Two men in neon vests kept cutting, pretending not to hear me, while Karen stood at the edge of the lawn, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of office. She smiled. That smile again. The kind that told you this wasn't about tree branches, it was about dominance. I charged forward, gravel biting into my soles. "You can't touch those trees. They're on my property." Karen tilted her head, feigning patience.
Actually, she said over the noise, the HOA Landscaping Committee has determined that these oaks are non-compliant with community standards. Section 12.3, Approved Foliage List. Non-compliant trees. Let that sink in. Have you ever seen someone manufacture a rule so absurd it feels like satire? That was Karen's specialty. And this wasn't the first shot she'd fired, it was just the loudest. Because weeks earlier, the petty wars had already begun. It started with parking fines. One morning I found a neon slip tucked under my windshield wiper. Unauthorized vehicle placement, fine $75. My truck was parked in my own driveway. I called the HOA office, expecting a clerical error. The secretary's voice was flat, rehearsed. Driveway use is restricted to vehicles under 80 inches in width. Your truck exceeds maximum width allowance. I laughed out loud. Are you telling me my Ford is too wide for my own driveway? Sir, she said without a hint of irony, you may appeal the citation at the next compliance hearing. So I went. I sat in a folding chair while Karen read the violation aloud, her gavel poised like she was presiding over the Supreme Court. I produced county property records showing my driveway was private easement, not HOA controlled. For a moment, the board members shifted uneasily. Then Karen slammed the gavel. Appeal denied. That's when I understood. This wasn't about bylaws. It was about pressure. She thought if she bleeded me with enough fines, enough hassles, I'd pack up and sell. The noise complaints came next. Every Friday night, I grilled on the back deck. Nothing outrageous, just burgers, maybe a little music playing from my radio, but by Saturday morning, there'd be a letter in my mailbox. Noise levels exceeded acceptable decibel threshold. Fine, $50. I knocked on my neighbor Mark's door to ask if he'd complained. He shook his head so quickly it was almost comical. No, May, he whispered. We all know who's filing them, but if I speak up, she'll come after me too. Fear. That was her currency. And now, the trees. Back to that morning. The sawdust was thick in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of cut oak. I stepped between the workers and the tree, arms outstretched. Touch that trunk again and you'll regret it. One of the men lowered his chainsaw uncertainly. The other looked at Karen. She didn't flinch. Continue, she ordered. Don't, I snapped. This property line is mine. I'll have you both cited for trespassing. That word trespassing hung heavy in the air. The workers hesitated. Chainsaw sputtered and fell silent. Karen's smile cracked just slightly. Mr. Daniels, you're obstructing community maintenance. That's another violation. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of the men, the chainsaws, the half-mutilated tree. And I'm documenting evidence of illegal destruction of private property, I shot back. Keep going. We'll see who the sheriff believes. The workers packed up fast after that, muttering apologies as they hauled their gear to the truck. But Karen lingered. You're making this harder than it has to be, she said, her voice low now, almost coaxing. Sell the cabin, take the profit, move somewhere you belong. There it was, the mask off. She didn't want my compliance. She wanted me gone. You don't get to decide where I belong, I told her. And for the record, I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes narrowed. Then you've declared war. She turned and walked away, clipboard pressed tight to her chest as if it were a shield. That afternoon I sat on the porch staring at the wounded oak. Its branches lay scattered across the grass, sap glistening like open wounds. I thought about my father planting that tree with his bare hands, about summers spent climbing it, about the idea that someone could walk in and declare it non-compliant. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about me. Every neighbor who whispered, every family who quietly paid their fines, they were all casualties of the same war. Karen had weaponized bylaws into a system of control. So I started digging deeper. I spent nights combing through the HOA's governing documents. Buried in the fine print was something most residents probably never noticed. The approved foliage list Karen had cited wasn't an official amendment. It was a policy memo she'd slipped into the compliance packet 2 years earlier, never ratified by a 2/3 majority vote as required by state law. In other words, it was fake. Armed with that knowledge, I drafted a letter, not just to Karen, but to every homeowner in Valley Lake. I laid out the truth in black and white. The fines weren't legitimate, the tree list wasn't binding, and they'd been paying for rules that didn't even exist. By the next HOA meeting, the air was electric. I walked in with a stack of copies under my arm, handing them out row by row. Neighbors snatched them up like contraband, scanning the pages, whispering to each other. Karen saw it. She saw her power slipping in real time. Her gavel cracked against the podium. "Out of order!" she barked. "Remove him!" But no one moved. No security guards, no board members willing to take her side. Just silence. I leaned forward, voice steady. "You've been running this community like your personal kingdom, but the law doesn't work on intimidation. It works on facts. And here's a fact: you've been violating your own bylaws." The room erupted, not with cheers, not yet, but with something more dangerous for Karen. Murmurs of dissent, people questioning, people doubting. Karen adjourned the meeting abruptly, storming out with her papers clutched tight. But the damage was done. Her veneer of absolute control had cracked again. That night I sat on the porch, staring at the scarred oak in the moonlight. The valley was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that was peaceful. It was the kind before a storm breaks. Because Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. She'd come at me with parking fines, noise complaints, and chainsaws. But what would she try next, now that her authority was being questioned out loud? Would she double down, or burn the whole neighborhood to the ground just to prove she still ruled?
Order! Order in this meeting! Karen's voice ricocheted off the cinder block walls, her gavel slamming so hard against the folding table that the cheap plastic pitcher of water rattled like it was about to explode. Faces turned, neighbors leaned in, and then she said it, the line that shifted the ground beneath the room. "This man is a dangerous squatter. He doesn't belong here." That was the cold open, burned into my memory like a scar. My name dragged through the mud in front of the very people who'd once waved from their driveways. You could hear the collective gasp ripple through the room, followed by an uneasy silence. Was she serious? Did she really just call me a squatter in a hall full of people who'd known my family for years? You could smell the tension. Stale coffee, burnt fluorescent lights, perfume too strong, sweat pooling in the summer heat. It was the kind of atmosphere where paranoia breeds, and Karen thrived on it. She banged that gavel again and again like she was sentencing me in a courtroom, only this wasn't a courtroom. This was the monthly HOA board meeting. The stakes weren't prison time, but something equally insidious: control of the neighborhood. Let me back up. 3 weeks earlier, I had received a letter, standard HOA stationery, pale blue ink, block text. "Attendance at the upcoming board meeting is mandatory," it read. "Failure to appear will result in fines and possible lien action." Imagine the arrogance. They threatened lien action on property they didn't even control. And yes, it was signed in her unmistakable cursive, "Karen L. Drummond, President, Valley Ridge HOA." I knew it wasn't a request. It was a summons. So I showed up, walked into that recreation hall on a Thursday evening, clutching my folder of documents, deed records, easement agreements, county filings, receipts in the purest sense of the word. And when I opened the door, all eyes locked on me. Dozens of neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, sitting on metal chairs that squeaked whenever someone shifted. The air buzzed like static. They weren't there for the usual HOA chatter about lawn hide or mailbox paint.
They were there for a spectacle. Karen sat at the front, elevated slightly on the makeshift dais, flanked by her loyal board members. She wore that smug navy blazer, a gavel in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. To her left was Mark, the treasurer, staring down at spreadsheets as if he'd been briefed not to look me in the eye. To her right, Linda, the secretary, scribbling furiously like she was documenting history itself. Karen leaned forward, pursed lips, waiting for the silence to thicken before she began. "Neighbors," she said, drawing out the word. "We are facing a crisis. This man," she pointed directly at me, jabbing the air with her manicured finger, "is occupying property that is subject to Valley Ridge bylaws, yet he refuses to comply. He parks without permits, ignores noise restrictions, and even claims ownership of common assets. He is a danger to the order we've worked so hard to maintain." The words weren't just lies, they were weapons, and she knew how to wield them. Some heads nodded, others frowned. I could feel the tide shifting. And then, like clockwork, the first planted question came from the back. "Is it true he hasn't paid dues?" a neighbor asked, his voice shaking with just enough anger to sound authentic. Karen seized the moment. "Exactly. No dues, no compliance, no accountability. He is, by every legal definition, a squatter." That's when I laughed. Not loud, not hysterical, but just enough for the room to hear. And I said, "You want to talk about definitions, Karen? Let's talk about the legal definition of authority. Because unless you've managed to annex private property into your HOA charter, which I highly doubt, your bylaws don't apply to me." Whispers, murmurs, a few gasps. People began to look at one another, eyebrows raised. That was my first crack in her facade. She knew it too, because she tightened her grip on the gavel until her knuckles turned white. She hammered it down again. "Out of order," she snapped. "This man is out of order." But I wasn't. Not legally, not morally, not factually. And the deeper I leaned into my calm, the more her hysteria exposed itself. That's the thing about bullies. They only thrive when no one challenges their script. Throw in a new line, and they stumble. The tension escalated when she pulled out what she claimed was evidence, a stack of violation notices she said had been mailed to me. She fanned them out dramatically, each one stamped in red ink: violation, fine due, final warning. She waved them like trophies. But here's the kicker. None of those notices had ever reached me, not one. And when I scanned the headers, I saw why. She had addressed them to Lot 47, Valley Ridge, HOA. That wasn't my address. My property wasn't even platted under Valley Ridge. She'd been mailing notices to a phantom lot. I raised the folder in my hands and said, "Funny thing about paper, Karen. It leaves a trail. Would you like me to read from the county records? Because I can tell you right now, Lot 47 belongs to the developer. Hasn't even been sold. So unless you're finding empty dirt, those notices mean nothing." The room shifted. Mark, the treasurer, looked up for the first time, his face pale. Linda, the secretary, stopped writing, and neighbors began to murmur, louder now, less controlled. I heard one whisper, "Wait, is that true?" Another asked, "Why would she find the wrong lot?" The tide was turning. She knew it. I knew it. And the cracks widened. Karen banged the gavel again, but this time the sound didn't silence the room. It sounded hollow, desperate, like the echo of authority slipping away. She raised her voice, straining to regain control. "Don't listen to him. He's twisting the facts. He doesn't belong here, and if we allow this behavior, none of us will be safe in our own homes." And that's when the confrontation reached its peak. I stepped forward, closing the distance to the dais, holding up my folder like a shield. "Safe?" I said, locking eyes with her. "You want to talk about safety? Then explain why you've been charging residents for lake access fees when the county deed shows I own the lake outright.
Explain why your board minutes don't list the votes that supposedly approved those fees. Explain why every time someone asks for records, you claim they're confidential. If you want to talk about safety, let's talk about financial safety, because it looks like you've been running a racket. Gasps this time weren't whispers. They were audible, sharp, cutting through the room like blades. A few neighbors stood up, demanding answers. Karen's face flushed crimson, her voice trembling as she shouted, "This meeting is adjourned!" But no one moved. They weren't ready to leave. They wanted answers. That was my mini-climax, the turning point. For the first time, she wasn't the unquestioned voice of authority. She was just a woman with a gavel, cornered by the truth she couldn't bury under paperwork. I'll never forget the look she gave me as the room buzzed with dissent. Pure hatred, sharpened by fear. She didn't say it out loud, but her eyes screamed it. This wasn't over, and she was right. Because when you threaten the empire of a self-crowned queen, you better be ready for the counterattack. So I left that hall with my documents intact, my reputation bruised but not broken. Neighbors looked at me differently that night, not as an outsider, but as someone who might actually have the courage to stand up against her machine. Yet as I walked into the humid night air, the thought gnawed at me. What would Karen try next? And just how far would she go to keep her grip on the valley?
Her gasp was sharp enough to cut through the stale air of the rec hall. I laid the documents flat on the folding table, the weight of a century's worth of ink and signatures crashing down louder than her gavel ever could. The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained white, lips trembling, eyes darting across the stamped seals. For the first time, she looked like a queen, stripped of her crown. I leaned in close enough for her to hear every word. "The valley isn't yours, Karen. It's mine. It always has been." That's the moment everything flipped. The crowd's energy shifted like a current reversing direction. Neighbors suddenly whispering in tones they'd once reserved for gossip over backyard fences. Smirks vanished. Doubt surfaced. A board that once sat smug and unbothered now stared at the stack of paper like it was radioactive. And Karen? Well, she just sat frozen, hands shaking ever so slightly as she tried to gather her composure. You want to know the truth? That wasn't the first time I'd brought those papers out. No, those documents had been in my family's safe for decades, passed down from my grandfather, who had bought the lake and surrounding acreage back when Valley Ridge was nothing more than farmland and dirt roads. But that night was the first time I had wielded them like a sword. And judging by the gasps in the room, I'd struck deep. 3 weeks earlier, I had made the decision. Up until then, I'd kept my family's deed quiet. Part of me thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA nonsense would burn itself out, and Karen would get tired of her little kingdom. But the more fines she sent, illegal, unenforceable fines, the more it became clear she wasn't going to stop. The final straw came in the form of a letter stuffed in my mailbox, her handwriting scrawled in the margins. Failure to pay lake access dues will result in suspension of privileges. Suspension of privileges? On my own lake. I remember crumpling that letter in my hand, standing at the shoreline as the sun went down, thinking, if she wants a war, I'll give her one. So I dug out the old files. Deeds filed with the county clerk, maps surveyed in the 1950s, signatures notarized in ink that had faded to brown. I made copies, had them certified, even checked with a real estate attorney who confirmed every line. No ambiguity, no loopholes. The valley was mine, free and clear, exempt from any HOA covenant. That was my nuclear option, and that night, in the suffocating heat of the meeting hall, I pushed the button. Karen tried to recover. She cleared her throat, slammed the gavel again, and forced out words through clenched teeth. These papers don't mean anything here. The HOA has jurisdiction over all properties within Valley Ridge boundaries. Her voice quivered, betraying her confidence. I countered before she could catch her breath. Really?
because, according to the county assessor, Valley Ridge doesn't even extend past Birch Hollow Road, and guess what sits beyond Birch Hollow? This lake, these cabins, this valley. Every inch of it deeded to my family before your HOA ever existed. The murmurs grew into something heavier now. Neighbors shifting in their seats, muttering questions, not to me, but to each other. One woman near the front spoke up, "Wait, Karen, is that true? You said all of us had access because the HOA maintained the shoreline." Another man added, "Yeah, where have our dues been going if we don't actually own the lake?" The dam was cracking. For years, Karen had thrived on secrecy, on neighbors too timid or too busy to question her paperwork. But now the truth was bleeding out in real time, and there was no stopping it. She snapped. "Enough! He's twisting everything. Do not let him distract you from the fact that he refuses to comply with community standards." Her finger stabbed the air at me, the same gesture she'd used at the last meeting when she called me a squatter. Only this time, fewer eyes followed her lead. Most were fixed on the papers in front of her. I could see Mark, the treasurer, quietly scanning the notarized deed. His lips moved as he read the lines, and then his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe even guilt. He finally muttered, "It's dated 1957, before incorporation." Linda, the secretary, looked sick to her stomach. That's when I decided to twist the knife. I leaned in again and said, "You've been collecting fees for a lake you don't own. Do you realize what that is, Karen? Fraud, plain and simple. Every check written to Valley Ridge HOA under the pretense of lake access, that's misrepresentation, that's criminal." You could have heard a pin drop. Eyes widened. Neighbors recoiled like they just realized they'd been played. Karen's empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. But here's the thing about people like her. They don't fold, they double down. Even as her board members shrank in their seats and neighbors muttered about refunds, Karen's voice rose higher, shriller, desperate. "He's lying! These papers are fabricated! I demand an independent audit!" Her face glistened with sweat under the flickering fluorescent lights. She looked less like a leader now, more like a cornered animal. That's when the small confrontation broke out. A neighbor in the back, a retired cop named Harris, stood up and spoke, his voice steady. "Karen, I've worked with county records for years. Those seals are legitimate. If you've been charging us for access you don't control, we need answers. Now." His words sliced through the noise, legitimizing what everyone was already thinking. Karen's gavel slammed again and again, but the sound no longer commanded obedience. It only underscored her unraveling. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of the room do the work. Neighbors pressed her with questions she couldn't answer. "Why didn't you disclose this? Where did the money go? Why didn't we ever see a vote?" It was chaos, the kind Karen used to orchestrate, but now couldn't contain. For once, the power dynamic had entirely shifted out of her hands. And yet, as satisfying as that moment was, I knew better than to think it was over. Because the look she gave me, eyes narrowed, lips curled, wasn't defeat, it was vengeance. A silent promise that if she couldn't bury me with fines, she'd find another way. And knowing Karen, that way would be ugly. The meeting eventually dissolved into shouting, neighbors demanding records, Karen storming out with her gavel clutched like a weapon. People lingered afterward, crowding around me, some apologizing for siding with her, others asking about refunds or legal steps. I gave them what answers I could, but inside, my mind was already racing. Because if Karen was willing to fabricate authority over my property, what else might she be willing to do? How desperate might she get once her mask had slipped? Walking back to my cabin that night, documents tucked under my arm, the crickets were the only sound. But even then, I felt it, the sense of being watched. Curtains shifted as I passed, silhouettes lingered in windows, and I couldn't shake the image of Karen, face twisted with rage, plotting her next move. What would she try now that the valley was mine?
"Remove your hands from me! This is harassment!" Karen's voice cracked as two uniformed officers each took an arm,
walking her down the gravel path. Their flashlights caught the edges of her clipboard, clutched tight to her chest like a shield, though its papers were scattering in the night breeze. Red and blue lights pulsed against the tree line, painting the cabins in flashes of chaos. Neighbors peeked from porches, silhouettes framed by lantern glow. And in that moment, Karen, the president of a crumbling HOA empire, wasn't in charge anymore. She was just another trespasser caught in her own web. You probably think that was the end of it, that when the police hauled her away, everything was wrapped up neat, tied with a bow. But no, this wasn't a movie with closing credits. This was my valley, my land, and Karen had spent years trying to carve it up for her own little fiefdom. What came next wasn't just punishment, it was a reckoning. The funny thing? It all started with the rule book she loved to wave like scripture. That binder of bylaws and amendments, updated every quarter, thick enough to choke a paper shredder. Karen thought it gave her power, but to me, it was a loaded gun, pointed right back at her. 3 weeks earlier, the battle lines had been quieter. Karen was still strutting into meetings with that smug smile, handing out fines like Halloween candy. One family got a $250 violation for improperly stored kayaks on their own dock. Another was cited for wind chimes, accused of creating noise pollution. Absurd on the surface, but technically grounded in the HOA's noise ordinance, if you squinted hard enough at the text. That was Karen's trick. She didn't enforce rules, she weaponized them. I needed proof of overreach, and more importantly, proof of personal gain. Rumors swirled about her backroom deals, contracts signed with cousins, inflated landscaping fees. The problem was, HOA boards aren't criminal courts. They're volunteer organizations shielded by procedural bureaucracy. To nail her, I'd have to use her own framework. Think of it as a chess match, where every piece was made of legal filings and signatures. That morning, I walked into the HOA office, technically just a converted storage shed with a copier and a filing cabinet, and requested the financials. According to state law, all members had the right to inspect records. Karen's face soured like spoiled milk. "Those documents aren't available without board approval," she snapped. But she was wrong. Section 3.14 of the bylaws clearly stated, any member in good standing may review annual financial statements with reasonable notice, and I had given notice. She stalled me for 2 weeks, hoping I'd let it go. I didn't. When the day finally came, I sat under the buzzing fluorescent light of that shed, flipping through invoices. Landscaping billed at triple market rate. Maintenance contracts signed to shell companies. Companies registered to Karen's own P.O. box. And right there, buried in a line item, were administrative stipends paid directly to her, never approved by a membership vote. It was fraud, plain and simple. But exposing fraud wasn't enough. Karen's grip on power wasn't built on money. It was built on fear. She controlled through intimidation, through late-night letters shoved under doors, through threats of liens that made retirees cry at meetings. If I wanted real revenge, I needed to shatter her reputation in front of everyone she had bullied. That opportunity came during the April board meeting. I can still see it, folding chairs lined up in the community hall, the air thick with dust and tension. Karen sat at the front table, gavel ready, posture stiff. Her allies, 3 board members who owed her favors, flanked her like guards at a throne. I waited until the agenda reached open comment, then stood, calm as stone. "I'd like to submit evidence," I said, dropping a folder on the table. "Copies of invoices, bank records, and the stipends." Karen's eyes narrowed like sword milk. But the room had already shifted. Neighbors leaned forward. Whispering started. One man muttered, "I knew it." The gavel hit wood. "This is out of order," Karen barked.
But bylaws allowed evidence submission during comment, and I knew that clause by heart. She tried to shout me down. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I read aloud the line items, each word like a nail in her coffin. Payment to Greenway Services, registered to 145 Valley Lane. Cross-reference that with the county records, and you'll see the address matches Karen's P.O. box. Gasps rippled through the hall. She stammered excuses, claimed it was a coincidence. But then I pulled the coup de grace. Copies of her own signatures approving stipends to herself without a recorded vote. Illegal under state nonprofit law. Neighbors erupted. Questions flew. Is this true? Have we been paying her? Karen slammed the gavel, screaming about defamation and malicious intent. But it was too late. The spell had broken. People saw her not as a leader, but as a con artist bleeding them dry. That's when the trespassing started. Stripped of credibility, Karen doubled down. She stormed into properties outside HOA boundaries, screaming at non-members to comply with community standards. One night she marched into my valley, clipboard raised like a sword, demanding I remove my boats from her lake, my lake. Neighbors filmed her tirade, laughter mixed with outrage, and when I warned her she was trespassing, she sneered, "You'll regret this." I didn't. She did. The sheriff's office had seen the financial records I'd compiled. They couldn't charge her with embezzlement. That was civil territory. But they could enforce trespass. The night she returned, stomping through my gate with 2 allies in tow, I made the call. By the time deputies arrived, Karen was mid-screech, accusing me of harboring illegal structures. They cuffed her not because she was a tyrant, but because she refused to leave private property after being warned. The irony wasn't lost on me. The queen of rules, taken down by the simplest one of all. Don't go where you're not welcome. Watching her dragged off, neighbors whispering, was almost too perfect. But let me tell you, revenge doesn't always taste sweet. It tastes heavy, like smoke after a fire, clinging to everything. Karen wasn't finished. She'd file appeals, draft angry newsletters, even threaten lawsuits. And I knew, deep down, the fight wasn't just about bylaws or trespass notices. It was about control, about one person's obsession with power in a place that was supposed to feel like home. So here's the question I'll leave you with. When someone like Karen loses everything, do they fade quietly into the night? Or do they come back, sharper and more dangerous than before?